Content warning. This story includes references to kidnapping, child abuse, and physical assault. He stood with one hand on the iron gate. Fingers settled in the space where the paint had peeled away, and something blackened beneath his nails. Rain from the late afternoon made the gravel at his boots slick. The gate was heavier than it should have been for a man used to turning wrenches and lifting engines, but heavier still because it held 1,000 small, unpaid moments, the missed birthdays, the slammed doors, the hush that had settled over a house that once knew laughter. Jacob had not meant to return. He had come because the house would not let him sleep, because something in him, an ache that had nothing to do with rusted bolts and fuel lines, would not let him stop thinking about the boy who carried his blood and the woman who carried his boy as her grief. Inside the mansion, a nursery light swung in a slow circle like a tired metronome. A mobile above the crib made a soft clink as the blind child turned his head toward a sound that meant safety. Amanda's humming. She rocked him as she had rocked him every night for 5 years, and each night the tune braided with the white noise of the city outside and the distant, brittle laughter of a sister who visited too often and stayed too close. The child, Peter as everyone called him, did not see the carriage of family photographs lining the hallway. He did not know the way papers slid from locked drawers, but he felt the rhythm of Amanda's pulse beneath his small hand, and that rhythm had been the center of his life. When Jacob lifted his hand from the gate, the click sounded like a small promise. He walked up the drive slow enough to notice the gardener's hand wiping at a spade, and the car, a black thing that gleamed even under cloud, parked too precisely in the motor court. He had been a mechanic for as long as he could remember, wrench in pocket, grease in the seams of his palm, taking what he could fix and making it run longer than it should. For years his life had run sideways to Amanda's. He repaired the pickups that fetched her groceries. He once tuned the engine on a dusty van while a newborn baby wailed inside, and later found himself watching the same baby through a window he did not have the right to cross. He was not there to beg. He was there because a rumor had spread along the streets of his neighborhood. Rumors travel quick where paper money moves quicker, and because a man who has a boy inside him will follow the sound of his name until it makes sense. The servants saw him first, an unfamiliar face at the gate, a silhouette against the rain. They told themselves it was a salesman, then a cousin, then someone lost. When the butler recognized the mud on Jacob's shoes, the telltale rectangular scar along his knuckle from an old job with a seized piston, he called Amanda. "Miss Amanda," he said, the words careful. "There's a man here. Says he knows Jacob." Amanda's hand stilled on the child's back. Her life had folded around routines. Doctor's visits, board meetings, endless appointments with people who asked for money and left traces of it around the house like crumbs. The nursery had become the one place that was private and public in the same breath. Everyone saw the child, but nobody knew why the child's eyes were dark pools that never focused on faces. She kept the blinds low and the house quieter than it used to be, the hum of staff and umbrellas layered over her grief. "Send him in," she said. Her voice met him at the door like a final question. Let him speak. Jacob moved through the room with the economy and caution of a man who had always been tolerated and not invited. He set his cap in his hands, the dust on its brim like a story he could not tell. Amanda watched him from where she sat, a posture she had perfected over 5 years, shoulders contained, a face that had learned to hold storms without letting them break through. Peter drifted in her arms, a small weight with a fierce grip on the fabric of her sleeve. There was no need for introductions. They had met before, in the kind of passing ways that make a house aware of the lives on its periphery. Jacob had fixed a generator in the back shed once. He had spoken to Amanda in a doorway years before, when she was still lighter with hope. He had been a presence in the margins of her life, the poor mechanic whose hands could coax life out of machines, but could not, it seemed, hold on to people. "I heard," Jacob began, and the sentence found its place in the space between them. He did not say, "my son." He did not say, "I think," either. He let the claim sit, small and hard, in the room. Amanda's laugh was without humor. "Everyone here claims somebody," she said. "What makes you different?" He looked at Peter, then at the ridge between Amanda's eyebrows, where the same worry rested every night. "He is mine," Jacob said. "He is my son." The arrival of Jacob, at once ordinary and impossible, should have been only a ripple, but it was the first stone thrown into a pond that had iced over and been walked on too long. Inside the mansion, under the veneer of normalcy, there were undercurrents. Amaka's visits that never really felt like visits, her easy smile that forgot to ask how Amanda was, and remembered instead to comment on the cost of curtains, the way Chisholm hovered in hallways as if waiting for permission to be seen. Amanda had accepted family in the way you accept weather you did not understand, as something that happens to you, not something you could control. Jacob's presence stirred the air. It made the butler look away. It made the cook pause in the kitchen. It made the blind child's fingers tighten on Amanda's sleeve, like a child who senses an unnamed threat. When Amaka arrived at dinner that evening, she wore a dress that caught the light and a face that caught the room. She hugged Amanda with the practiced ease of someone who keeps her hands warm with other people's misfortunes. "You shouldn't be so hard on yourself," she told Amanda with a sister's ease that was colder than she let on. "You have everything here. Nothing more to ask." Amaka's life had been a series of improvisations. She had 2 boys who wanted more than she could provide. Chisholm, who wanted to be a man the way men with quick tempers wanted to be, and Emma, softer and slant-eyed about labor. When money came, she treated it like oxygen, necessary and therefore invisible in its absence. She had learned early how to hold the room and tilt it toward her needs. When Amanda went into that late pregnancy, surrounded by whispering staff and the hush of concern, Amaka moved closer, not with the curiosity of a sister, but with the calculation of a merchant seeing a market open. The swap happened in a place that should have been sterile and holy, St. Nicholas Hospital. The corridors smelled of bleach and coffee and the tired perfume of nurses who had not seen daylight in hours. There was a room with a window that woke to the delivery ward, a small nursery with incubators lined like sleeping animals. In the recording of what followed, and there would be a recording later that everyone would wish had never been taken, the light fell in a certain pale way, and the music of the hospital held its breath. Amanda remembered the sound of the newborn's cry as a relief that never left her. She remembered how Dr. Admi came with a smile and a clipboard, and the kind of hands that had long since learned how to be precise. The doctor had a reputation. Competent, discreet, someone hospitals liked because he could make paperwork look like mercy. What Amanda did not know that day, what she could not have guessed, was that the same hands that tied umbilical clamps could be closed to a different kind of honesty, that a white coat could be bought the way a ledger was. Amaka visited the nursery under the pretense that sisters had duty. She stood in the doorway and watched Amanda hold the small pink miracle. The conversation they had was ordinary, and then not. Amaka asking in a low voice about the child, offering help that sounded like charity. Behind the flirt of pleasantries was a plan that had been scrawled in the margins of a life running out of options. "You will need help," Amaka said, in a tone that gave no space for refusal. "You are alone. Let me bring the baby to my room for a bit while you rest." Amanda, exhausted and buoyed by the relief of the delivery, did not think to refuse. The staff of St. Nicholas were busier than watches. They were efficient, and they trusted. They were tired. A nurse took the child into a small outer room and came back with a tray. When Amanda asked for her baby, the nurse placed another infant in arms that were trembling from labor and months of anxiety. There was a soft, unquestioning acceptance in the action. This was a place where someone must be trusted and someone must be believed. The swap was not cinematic. It was a slow exchange of small things: a cloth, a tag slid under a mattress, a whispered line about a shortage of staff. Dr. Admi had his reasons: greed or perhaps survival in a system that paid promises in silence. And he took the envelope with fingers that had once been clean. He told himself he was doing a kindness to a woman who needed a child to belong to a name with money behind it. He told himself lies the way men tell themselves lies when they start wearing the weight of the consequences of their own choices. Amanda left St. Nicholas with a child in her arms, her name on a discharge paper, and the sense that something fundamental had been made whole again. What she had not left with was the awareness that a clean tag, the small metal band hospitals put on ankles or wrists at birth, had been moved. She did not see the other child being tucked in a blanket and taken through a back entrance where the taxi drivers knew how to look away. She had no idea that 5 years later, when a poor boy at St. Mary's orphanage hummed a tune to himself to ease the hunger in his belly, he would be the son she had carried beneath her heart. Jacob was there, at a distance, the day she brought that child home. He had stood outside hospital corridors, fingers scuffed with grease and tension, watching the small procession of people and cars. He had reached for a life that had been promised to him in whispers and had been denied in polite turns of phrase. He knew, in a way that had little to do with paperwork and more with the smell of new skin, that the baby Amanda held was not the one he had touched by those same cold tiles. But suspicion without proof is a thing that can either ruin a man or sharpen him. Jacob chose to leave. He left because the house was not his, because he feared the doors the money could close against him, and because he thought protection might be the best form of distance. The years that followed were mosaic pieces that fit wrong. At the mansion, Peter grew into a child of routine and small guardian angels. Nurses who knew the exact 15 minutes before he reached full exhaustion. Toys adapted to teach him hearing in place of sight. Lessons to help him navigate a world without the comfort of sight. Amanda loved him with a fierce, wide thing, but love cannot keep the edges of cruelty from forming when inside a house there is a sense of ownership and someone is meant to be kept in a certain place. Chisholm learned cruelty the way others learn to pour tea, with impatient hand and a glare that could slip under the skin. He befriended Peter the way a predator befriends prey, close enough to be seen with him, far enough to keep the teeth hidden. A child who cannot see is easier to bully. He is not irrelevant, but he is quieter, more compliant to the hands that shape him. Chisholm's jokes began as small pinpricks, calling Peter names behind his back, slipping small obstacles where he would walk, taking his toys and pretending it was a game. Those pinpricks, over time, built into scars. Meanwhile, in a whitewashed dormitory at St. Mary's orphanage, a different child learned to feed his mind because he could not always feed his body. Philip, the boy who would grow brilliant and hollow in the same breath, discovered books left in a forgotten crate and pocketed knowledge the way other children pocket sweets. He learned to repair a broken radio with the patient hands that had been given to him by a father who knew how to fix things. He read by the light of a tin lamp and listened to transmissions on a static-filled shortwave set. He memorized facts in the way a man prepares a case, drafting evidence for a life he would one day demand. The orphanage was not cruel in the active sense. It was simply a place where resources were thin and where the people there were tasked with saving too many children on too little. The matron, a woman who smelled like boiled tea and hand-stitched fabric, was kind but overworked. She could not attend to each child's private hunger and each child's secret intellect. Philip grew thin in flesh, but wide in cunning. He learned to speak quietly, to ask for the smallest things with the competency of someone used to negotiating with what little they had. He drew a map of the world in margins of reading materials, and in his drawings he added little notes, names he did not own, places he had never been, an engine fixed in a place that did not exist, and a face that might belong only in an imagined mirror. Jacob watched all of this with a slow burning guilt. He had loved someone once. Mariam, his wife, who kept house and produced a small daughter named Helen, who learned to ride a bicycle faster than she learned to stop crying. Jacob's life was a balance sheet of small satisfactions and a constant, precise accounting of what he owed to himself and what he owed to others. He had been beaten once, by men who came in the night to tell him to leave, who made it clear that certain questions should remain unasked. His face wore that history, a crescent scar across his temple, where someone had raised a hand and left a story. He fixed cars and made small money. He fixed radios and borrowed books, keeping the larger question, about the child they said belonged to Amanda, inside him like an ember. He thought of his son in pieces, a thread of DNA, a lullaby hummed in a room where the light never caught his eyes. He wanted to push, to demand, to stand under the mansion's gates and tell a billionaire what she did not want to hear. He knew that would only get him a door slammed in his face, or a quiet call to men who knew how to make the poor stop asking. Amaka, meanwhile, prospered in the way rain collects in low places. She moved through the city with the competency of someone who had learned how to use sorrow as opportunity. She would apologize for sins she did not commit and demand help for problems she had quietly manufactured. She managed to become indispensable to Amanda in a particular way. The sister who could be trusted to hold things, the one who could quietly control the staff and the sitter and the subtle levers inside a house with more money than conscience. When the black sedan parked in the drive became too polished to be coincidence, people inside and outside the house began to trade glances that meant something like alarm. But outside, the world assumed Amanda's life was the life she presented. Elegant, expensive, and above suspicion. Time moves oddly when stretched by secrets. Inside the mansion, the rhythm became Amanda reading aloud at night, Peter's soft humming as he learned textures by touch, the clack of high-heeled shoes in hallways on errands that had nothing to do with small men whose names were sung under breath. At the orphanage, time was different. It was the stretch between meals and the moments where half attention became education. Philip took those minutes and turned them into leverage. Jacob's return did not happen in a single moment of revelation. It was the slow accumulation of things that did not fit. It was the sound of a child's shoes in the hallway when no child should have been moving. It was a nurse muttering about records and a tag that didn't match. Small details are what break lies. A hospital bracelet with a name that had been switched. A vaccination record that had no signature where one was supposed to be. Amanda began to sense these tiny seams, and like all people who have loved badly and continuously, she started to pull. The episode that would fracture the careful surface of their lives began with a stumble. It was a day like any other. The sun judged the house by how the blinds tilted. The cook made a late soup for someone who did not come to dine, and Peter, who had only learned the world as a map of sound and touch, toppled. He fell down a flight of stairs, a child with a small chest and too much trust in the sounds that guided him. The fall did what a fall does. It jolted the world. It made the impossible become immediate. Amanda rushed him to St. Nicholas with the panic of a mother who has loved a child through grief and cannot bear a new kind of loss. At the hospital, the air smelled the same as the day of the swap. Bleach, antiseptic, the thin coffee of staff who had practiced the art of keeping going. Doctors moved with quick competence. Peter's head was assessed. There was a bruise that worried them, a scan that demanded context. He needed a transfusion. Medical staff asked questions meant to harvest urgent facts, blood type, allergies, previous conditions. Amanda, composed, gave names and data, as if one could will a child well by filling out forms. When the first test result came back, it was a small clinical note that read like a short sentence in a book you can't finish. Peter's blood type did not match Amanda's. It read like an error on paper, an anomaly to be checked. Amanda signed forms, and her eyes were a battlefield. They ran the test again. The machines hummed, and the fluorescent lights steadied. Each repeat confirmed the initial result. The blood did not match. The nurse's clip of paper slipped in a way that suggested something larger than a clerical error. In cold rooms like that, one learns quickly that what you think you know can be a dangerous shelter. Amanda stood with the small weight of Peter in her arms and felt the world narrow until it fit only on the organ that held her breath. She thought of the early days of being led to the nursery at St. Nicholas. She thought of Amarka's hands, of the way the sister had suggested a momentary watch so Amanda could sleep. She remembered Dr. Adme's smile. The mind constructs an entire crime from a single clue. He had been a good man, a trusted man, a man who wore his neatness like armor. Why would he have lied? They called Jacob because he had been at the gates, because a man who keeps his hands in oil sometimes keeps his ears open to gossip. He came to the hospital without fanfare. His hands were steady, as Peter slept under the thin sheet in Amanda's arms. He touched the child's small wrist like a man searching for the echo of kin. He did not pretend to hold knowledge he did not have. He came with the blunt, lifelong experience of a man who knows how to read the sign of a problem on a face and cannot be bribed into silence with small kindnesses. "I know where the other boy might be," Jacob said. He did not know exactly, but he had enough memory of the hospital's backs and quiet doors to make an accusation that would not be immediately dismissed as a poor man's spite. The nurse looked at Amanda as if to measure the temperature of her sanity. Amanda's hands did not tremble. She folded her jaw and moved with the deliberation of somebody who had been holding on to a painful set of truths for half a decade. The first person to go into defensive mode was Amarka. Her voice was measured, the kind of voice that had been honed to seem wounded yet reasonable. "This is ridiculous," she said, then softer. "We have all suffered." Her eyes flicked to Dr. Adme, a man whose neatness now looked like a mask. He adjusted his glasses and said that records could be checked. He sounded like a man frightened of a spreadsheet that could not reconcile. Jacob suggested they request old CCTV. The words had the weight of a hammer, practical, immovable. In the hospital, CCTV is banal. It watches corridors and doors, and nothing extraordinary. But when a lie has been constructed around an event that was small, mechanical and human, the camera becomes a terrible witness. There are moments when a truth begins to unspool, and everyone in the room becomes a character in a story they wished they had not read. Amanda felt the room tilt. The butler, the nurse, the doctor, Jacob. Everyone held a breath. "Get me the tapes," Amanda said finally. Her voice left no room for argument. She could feel behind her ribs years of a maternal hunger that had not been satisfied, not by prestige or money, and now it was clawing for clarity. Before the tape could be retrieved, before the first frame could be examined, other things happened that made waiting a dangerous luxury. Amarka stepped into the light with a smile that suddenly felt thin. Chisholm looked at Jacob, as if knives could be passed through looks. Emma hovered like someone whose hands had never learned to hold anything heavy. Dr. Adme's neat fingers had started to tremble. The hospital administrator, a man whose clothes were always slightly too crisp for the building he worked in, found reasons to look into files, as if looking into the past could erase what had been done. The small staff at St. Nicholas shifted. Things are different in a house where one person has money and another has none. The tapes were in an office, catalogued and logged like all things are when you believe you can control them. To ask for CCTV was to invite a scrutiny that would reveal not only the swap, but also the pattern of appointments and favors and payments. It was to ask a question that required an answer that would bruise many hands. Amanda did not want to watch the footage by herself. She demanded to see it with Jacob. There was a grim logic to her decision. Better to have a man who could see a sly detail in the way a door opened, a man who had an eye sharpened by years of fixing life's broken parts. Jacob agreed. He felt, in the way a man who has been away feels when he returns, the way his heart was preparing for either a closure he could accept or a jaggedness that would not leave him whole. They sat in an office that smelled faintly of paper and old coffee, while the technician cued the footage. The screen flickered and then steadied. In the first frames, they saw nothing unusual. Nurses passing, the hum of the world, a cart turned aside. The angle that made the corridor look narrower. In a corner of the screen, a woman, a marker, walked through, smiling. The camera held her hand as if time had returned a favor. Then an incubator door closed, a tag slipped, fingers moved in ways that meant something else entirely. Jacob's breath caught like the start of a gear engaging. Amanda's lips went pale. The tape did not yet show the moment they needed. It showed the prelude, the cash exchange in a corridor shadow, the doctor's hand reaching for an envelope in a drawer. It showed enough that the technician who watched began to look like a man who had watched too many things he had never wanted to see. At that moment, the simple plan to watch a tape became an act that could not be undone. The world outside, with its hawkers and its bus horns and its small, impatient markets, continued. But inside that room, the past rearranged itself into a new shape. Faces that had seemed ordinary were now suspect. A sister's smile became a strategy, a man's neatness a wage for a lie. Jacob felt the first real thing bloom in him that was not guilt or fear. Hope. Hope moves like a small, sudden flame in a man who has been cold for long. It makes decisions seem possible. It makes a plan that was once cowardly now necessary. He looked at Amanda and saw a woman who had worn grief like armor. And he saw in that armor the place where bullets had lodged and never been removed. "Get me everything from St. Nicholas," Amanda said to the technician as if making a contract. "All tapes for that week, every record. And Dr. Admi, he will come with us." The decision cracked the surface of the fiction that had been built. It made Amaka's smile harden into a fist. It was the first time the house that had kept so much quiet really began to tremble. Outside, the rain had stopped. Jacob left the mansion that night, with his hands empty and his pockets lighter for the courage that had no currency. In his sleep, he dreamt of a boy reading beside a tin lamp and hands that were too small to be all that a father required. Amanda dreamt of a hospital corridor that stretched like a rope and of names unlatched from tags, stories collect witnesses. That night, the people who had watched the tape carried the image somewhere in their chest, like a pebble they could not spit out. The idea of a swapped life was now out of the bag. When something like that gets out, it seeks the light, and it does more than ask for justice. It demands reckoning. For some, the reckoning would be a salvation. For others, it would be a dissolution. Amaka found herself sleepless and angry in a house she had learned to patrol. She called Chisholm and spoke quickly, her words tight like cords. He listened, and then came to the mansion the next morning with his face arranged in contrition. He asked to see Peter, to speak, to be forgiven. He did it with the kind of fake sincerity that had kept him safe until then. Jacob watched him from the courtyard and felt, in the way a man who shapes metal feels the heat of a forge, that he was about to be tested. Meanwhile, at St. Mary's, Philip hummed to himself about electrons and gears. He chewed on the edge of a book and drew a map of a house he had never been to, but that he could describe in the way an engineer describes an engine. Parts in relation, connections that must be made. He had friends at the orphanage who loved him in small, breakable ways. He had a matron who sometimes pressed her palm over the side of his face and whispered a blessing she could barely afford to give. He would not know, yet, that a television set in a small sitting room would play a clip that would make his name possible to the woman who had been his mother by accident. Jacob's return had broken the surface. It had put a question in motion. It had made men who believed their lies were safe suddenly watch the doorway more closely. It had made Amanda decide that the truth was no longer something held in her hands, but something to be pursued with a focus she had thought lost. The house began to feel hollowed out, like fruit that someone had begun to peel. Staff members took sides quietly. The gardener whispered to the driver. The butler adjusted his tie as if he were preparing for an unveiling. The mansion's library, which had once been a place where Amanda read about governance and economies, became a room where papers were shuttled and where the word evidence took on a new, treacherous meaning. Jacob slept that night in a small guest room that smelled faintly of antiseptic and a perfume he did not know. He dreamed of a boy he had fixed a radio for, a small child who had once sat on his knee and learned how to hold a screwdriver. In the dream, the boy laughed, and the sound was a map to a place Jacob had been too afraid to go back to. He woke with a small, fierce resolve. By morning, the hospital administrator had pulled records and found anomalies. Dr. Admi confronted, stammered, and then smoothed a claim about being paid for overtime. He imagined his neat life could be kept neat if he could only explain himself, if he could only call what he did a mistake bathed in good intention. He did not yet understand how small choices pile into a mountain of consequences. Outside the hospital, the matron at St. Mary's fielded a phone call that would tighten her chest. Someone asking questions about a boy with a hunger for learning, about dates and names that had never been attached to a child who had been given a new name. Amanda sat in the office and watched the footage again, frame by slow frame, while Jacob stood at the shoulder of truth, like a man who had come to be counted in a story he had not authored. The tape showed hands that were familiar and yet unreadable. It showed a marker in the frame, and it showed the doctor's hand in a drawer. It showed small movements that could be the simple labor of hospital staff, or they could be the evidence of a crime. When Jacob saw the clip of the nursery door closing and the camera catching nothing but a faint exchange of motion behind the curtain, he felt the weight of all the things he had refused to accept press upon him. He thought of Philip in the orphanage, reading by a lamp on a night when hunger was louder than lullabies. He thought of Helen, his daughter, who would grow up thinking that her family had been defined by small, private courage, and not by the loud justice of the world. Outside the building, the city lived on. Hawkers sold oranges with the same hands that sold cigarettes and hope. Buses coughed and children played soccer between puddles. Inside, the tape clicked and rewound and people braced. The first set of questions had been asked. The second, more dangerous ones waited. Who would answer? Who would hold their ground? Who would fall first? Amarka called her lawyer and made a plan that was both fierce and delicate. She could not let a sister's grief undo the scaffold that had raised her boys to a life a little more comfortable. Chisholm began to panic in ways he could not name. Emma, who had never been asked to do much beyond nod and agree, avoided the butler and pretended to help with errands that were meaningless. Dr. Admi's neat hands were suddenly stained in the mind, a doctor who had traded a line on a ledger for silence. Jacob left the mansion that afternoon with a paper bag of change and a small, crumpled receipt from the hospital. He kept the receipt like a talisman. It announced nothing, proved little, but it promised a way into the next step. Proofs of hospital admissions, fragments of tags, the tiny evidence that law and reason would need to do their slow work. He walked back into his neighborhood, and the street wrapped itself around him like a body that knew him by weight and by smell. Men nodded because he was Jacob the mechanic. Women sold bread and coins clinked. Nothing in the world outside had yet changed, but inside, a slow machine had been set in motion. CCTV requests had been filed. A list of names had become a list of suspects. The word swap traveled in private and in low voices. It leapt, like a small flame, into the places where people kept gossip and courage. The concluding chapter had not yet been written. Arrests had not been made. DNA had not been run. But a draft had begun, and in drafts the future waits with a nervous patience. That night, when Jacob went back to his small home and sat with a sparse dinner, He thought of the child at St. Mary's who had memorized the path of stars by tracing them in the dust on the ground. He thought of the house where a blind boy hummed and a wealthy woman watched the world with a vigilance reserved for those who have lost something priceless. He counted, as men do, not his money, but his choices. To leave, to return, to watch a tape with a woman he barely knew but who held his son in her arms. The list was short and sharp. Amanda, sitting by the nursery window, folded a tiny sweater and placed it in a drawer. Her hands moved without ceremony. She had built a life inside grief and wealth, and now she found herself at the edge of a decision she had not imagined she would have to make. To demand the truth, even if that truth would split open the only family she had left. The television in the sitting room, a muted thing that had been kept for no reason other than a sense of normalcy, hummed with news from the city that did not yet know the story it would soon be telling. And somewhere, in a dormitory where a child named Philip woke and rolled over on a straw mattress, a television set in a common room flicked to a health segment that would, in minutes, cut to footage of St. Nicholas Hospital and the pale, regular faces of people who would soon be cited as suspects. Philip hummed the tune he had taught himself for comfort, and did not yet know that his name was about to be called into a house where once he had no place to belong. The return of the poor mechanic had been a soft knock. It had become, overnight, a battering of something that had been built carefully from lies. The mansion, which had once seemed impenetrable, now held in its rooms the whisper that the most secure things are the easiest to break. Jacob's hand on the gate was only the first of many touches that would open doors. When the technician finally clicked through the tape, the frame that would make a life change sat there like a small, ordinary moment. A hand slipping a tag, a nurse unaware of the motion, a woman's back as she left the room. Amanda did not look away. Jacob watched the slightest tilt of a head and knew the gravity of what he had been chasing. The camera would not lie, it only recorded. But what you choose to do with a recording is where truth becomes more than an image, where it becomes a demand. In the weeks to come there would be interviews, police statements, and DNA swabs. There would be the noise of lawyers and the quiet of hospital corridors reconciling their paper files. There would be Amaka's defiant pleas and Chisholm's inability to keep his temper from showing. There would also be the quieter work of a mother who would have to decide how to hold two children and how to love a son she had raised in a lie. For now, however, that future was a hinge waiting to swing. Jacob closed his eyes that night with the taste of the tape on his mind and the image of a boy in a dormitory reading by a lamp. He did not know what the next morning would bring, but he had returned to a place that kept secrets, and now those secrets had begun to cough. If this is a story that moves you, stay. There are more rooms to open. The tape had begun to play, and in its slow turning, the house was waking. Content warning. This story includes references to kidnapping, child abuse, and physical assault. The tape had done its work like a blade, precise, clinical, merciless. After the technician fed frame after frame into the monitor, the sequence of small movements resolved into a single, undeniable act. A white coat moved in a corridor, an envelope slipped across a nurse's palm. A tag that should have stayed tied was taken and folded into a pocket. Amaka's silhouette passed through the shots twice, once smiling at a nurse, once threading herself through the doorway of the nursery with the casual ease of someone who had practiced being present. Dr. Adme's gloved fingers opened a drawer and closed it again with the slow certainty of someone who had rehearsed an exit. The office smelled of stale coffee and paper, but the air felt raw. Jacob pressed his thumbs into his eyelids as if he could squeeze a lie out of the world. Amanda watched the screen with a clarity that was almost surgical. Grief had taught her how to see facts like bones. When the frame showed the doorway where a second infant had been wheeled away by a hand that kept its face out of camera range, she felt something in her chest unclench and then break in a different place. "Call the police," Amanda said without looking away. Her voice did not tremble. It was a command shaped by the patient logic of someone used to making decisions under pressure. The technician's hands shook as he rewound and forwarded the clip until the moment she wanted to hold on was as precise as a photograph. Legal procedure arrived with the slow authority of institutions. A senior inspector from the Lagos division, a man who had spent his career thinking in the language of forms and warrants, came with a sergeant and a PDA filled with bureaucratic weight. He listened politely as Amanda explained what had been discovered. He nodded when the footage was shown and moved immediately to make the requests that would make the evidence repertory official: seizure forms, chain of custody paperwork, orders for backup hard drives. Amaka, when the first officers arrived at the mansion, had not yet believed the possibility of being unmasked. She had built a self-defense of plausible deniability and the expectation that the wealthy sister could absorb scandal the way a wall absorbs damp. Her first response when Amanda called her down to the drawing room was to make the expression of devastation that had served her before. A hand over the heart, tears that might have been real if she had not practiced them so often. "You think I would do such a thing?" Amaka said, voice pitched to wounded incredulity. "Amanda, you must have been wrong. There are procedures to follow." Amanda spoke to her the way someone reads from a ledger. "The footage is here. The nurse will be called. The doctor is on his way with the hospital administrator. The police are here." She waited, and the way she waited was like the mechanical certainty of the tape itself. "If you have anything to say it now." For a moment, Amaka's face did something that was not quite fear and not quite calculation. She reached for the rails of a chair as if it might hold her upright. She dialed a number with hands that no longer trembled with spontaneity, but with someone who had to narrate a defense. Her voice on the phone thinned. She told a short, sharp lie to the lawyer she loved to use, that this was a misunderstanding, a mistake in administration, a slur that could be managed. The lawyer promised to be there. Outside, Chisholm lurked on the periphery like a sentinel waiting for orders. When the officers asked if anyone else lived in the house who should be accounted for, the butler mentioned Amaka's sons. The sergeant's eyes moved to the corridors, the corners where nuisance could breed. He asked politely for them to be brought down. Chisholm arrived with a swagger that was brittle, indignation painted onto his features like a mask. When an officer gently told him he was not free to leave, he laughed too loudly and then tried to push past the two men holding the door. The situation turned physical when he shoved at an officer. The sergeant, trained for defiance, reacted with a restraint that kept the scene from becoming worse. Chisholm's hands closed on air, and he found himself with handcuffs pressing into his wrist as not quite suspect, not yet accused. That first arrest was messy in the language of small houses. Paper and faces, the press of little dignities lost. It was also necessary. The police could not take Amanda's word and the tape and move immediately to convictions. They had to build a case that a court would accept. They took statements. They seized devices. They gave Dr. Admi the option of cooperation. In a small white room at St. Nicholas, where the light made shadows cruel, Dr. Admi sat with the weight of his coat like an accusation. He had always been a man who wore the right ties and kept his papers tidy. The ledger was his sense of moral order. When confronted with a sequence of transfers on his account and shadowy receipts, his composure bifurcated. At first he disclaimed memory. Then, when evidence rendered memory useless, he began to speak in a voice that sounded as if it had been carved out of denial. "It was not only money," he said, fingers twisting a pen. "There were promises. People said things would be better for the hospital if I—" He stopped. He was careful to blame the system he had fed rather than the decisions he had made. "She came to me with urgency, and she had reasons. We made arrangements. I thought I could justify it." A lawyer from the public prosecutor's office penned his notes vigorously. The policeman, who had once been a nurse himself, listened with a kind of private disgust. "Who else?" the inspector asked, soft but direct. Names came. Amarka, Chisholm, one nurse whose signature had been slipped onto a discharge form, and an attendant who had seen money change hands in a corridor and had believed that loyalty could be purchased. At St. Mary's Orphanage, the news arrived wrapped in confusion. The matron answered the call in an office lined with children's drawings and a calendar whose pages had never been torn off in time. The sergeant spoke quietly and held out a photograph of a thin boy who read beside a lamp. The matron's hands shook, but she controlled her face. She had tended loss for so long that when grief arrived, it came with the rigors of habit. "Philip?" she said, and the word fell into the room like a small miracle. Philip, who had been folding a page into a model of a radio, looked up at the voice, and then slowly walked to the visitors' room where strangers in uniforms waited with papers. He wore his intelligence plain as a coat, alert, a little guarded, as if he were ready for a math problem no one had yet explained. He smelled faintly of boiled cassava and 2 days without different clothing, and the light in his eyes was old, as if he had spent too many nights thinking. The investigators were careful. For every frame of conviction there had to be a chain of custody, an explanation that would not splinter in court. They took Philip to a clinic, explained the purpose with medical formality, and asked for a DNA swab. Philip submitted to the sterile cotton, with the quiet of someone who had learned that cooperation often brought the least pain. The matron held the edge of the paper and watched as a new possibility formed like frost. When the test came back, expedited with the insistence of one of the family's legal representatives and the public interest now fully present, the numbers made sentences in the way only science can. Philip's markers matched Amanda's in the way that bloodlines do, a high confidence percentage, a clarity that banished the last of the ledger's doubts. Jacob, who stood in a corridor outside the clinic with his hands folded like a man trying to hold himself steady, felt the air change. You could see it on him. A man who had lived by the feel of things now had proof that the feel had been right. The press was not slow to gather. It came like a tide of curiosity and cruelty, the kind of light that strips a person into the simplest shapes. Cameras waited outside St. Nicholas. A local station ran a segment about hospital ethics. Social media turned conjecture into verdicts. The mansion, once shielded with layers of reputation, began to experience the heat of public scrutiny. Inside the house, Amanda moved with the austere focus of someone who had always handled public crises. Her board of directors at the foundation called. People on the phone offered sympathetic noises while calculating distance. Some sympathized publicly. Others pivoted and suggested a temporary leave from public duties until the matter was resolved. The world that trusted her for stewardship now measured liability. Amanda registered that loss with the kind of clinical stoicism that a person who has been bereaved learns. Possessions recede, and the core remains. She also had to reckon with the private damage of deception. Peter, meeting each day with the echo of a hand he trusted, was both the child she had loved and a reminder that love can be misapplied. She sat for hours with him after the surgery. The head injury had left him groggy and flinching at bright rooms, and watched the small movements a mother notices, the way his fingers reached for texture, the way he hummed a tune when he slept. She told him, in words chosen with the tenderness of a woman who must not harm what she has, that things had changed, and not changed all at once. She promised him the continuity of care and the ongoingness of love. Jacob did not demand a place at Amanda's table. He refused to be bought with a title. But the community shifted. Neighbors who had once spurned him offered sour grace. Mariam and little Helen came to the clinic the day the DNA was confirmed. Helen, who had never seen a cold room of papers, found herself holding a child she had been told was another woman's son, and whose small, thin hand felt familiar around her finger. She did not shout. She pulled Philip toward her like a magnet. He sat awkwardly, unsure at first how to accept the sudden proximity of a sister whose existence had been as mundane as a bicycle ride and as charged as a new claim. The reunion in the clinic's small waiting room was not the cinematic triumph of film, but the hesitant, truer thing. A woman on one side, a man on the other, a child between them trying to reconcile the map of a life he had sketched in cardboard with a house he had never seen beyond a television image. Philip looked at Amanda with intelligence and caution. Amanda looked at him with the mixture of hunger and apology that defined so many of her mornings. Jacob watched them and felt how the knot of his life adjusted. Pile by pile, the formal case built itself. The police presented the hospital administrator with the CCTV frames. The receipt trail, that had once seemed like humble exchanges, now read as pieces of a bribery ledger. Dr. Admi, who had been at first small and recalcitrant, folded and gave testimony that placed a marker in the timeline more clearly. The sister had asked favors, handed over envelopes, and engineered access. He named names and times and the nurse who had been paid under a night watchman's silence. Chisholm's hand in one frame came back to haunt him. He had been there the day Amanda left the hospital with a child and returned later, swaggering in a way that no one had thought to interrogate until now. The first formal accusations were filed: conspiracy to commit child theft, unlawful release of an infant, breach of medical trust. The state pressed charges with the subtlety of a legal body that knew how to make a fragile thing brittle. Amaka, Chisholm, and Dr. Admi were taken in, cuffs again, and Emma was summoned for questioning. Emma's lawyer pleaded confusion and ignorance. She said she had been complicit by omission more than by action. The prosecution's file, however, had enough to make the case difficult for the defense. A confrontation in the drawing room, recorded by the mansion's private security cameras and delivered with the right of public interest paperwork by the police, carried a sting beyond the legal. Amanda facing Amaka with the rawness of two people who had been sisters and had become hosts to very different moral economies. Amanda did not raise her voice. She did not need to. "You came into my life as a sister," she said. "You left me with a crime." Amaka's face changed the way a mask might slip. Something like fear, like regret, like calculation, passed through. "You think I took your child," she said, a whisper-turned weapon. "Do you know what it is to watch your family break when you have nothing? Do you know how it feels to have to feed a child with no options?" Amanda's reply was a quiet thing. "I know what it is to lose a child, and I know your hands were the ones who moved that loss into our lives," she said. "If this is about survival, we will find a way to feed a family without stealing a life." Those words landed with a shudder. Amaka tried the old pleas: poverty, desperation, a misinterpreted kindness. They had once worked like solvents. Now they made the record on the table glint like evidence. The police led her away, and in the hush after, Amanda sat with the sense that the house she had curated for years was a stage where the scenery had been stolen from her. Chisholm's arrest was not neat. He cursed in the stairwell, trying a last-ditch argument that weaponized his youth and male anger. He shoved at a constable and was shoved back. The cuffs were applied with a firmness that conveyed the message. A child's life was not to be lost in the braggadocio of inherited entitlement. Emma, questioned as a witness, and then as a possible accessory, collapsed into the quiet of a witness room and cried for the way she had always been asked to be inconspicuous and had complied. Across town at St. Mary's, the matron watched Philip's departure in a small taxi that smelled faintly of perfume and antiseptic. She had fed 1,000 small hungers, and had watched the world give little back. She kissed his forehead and told him to find a place to keep his books. The idea that a child raised in an underfunded dormitory could be snapped into a different life by a legal finding felt both miraculous and unfair. She worried for the boy who knew how to ration his affection. Court proceedings opened with a flurry of motions and press statements, but moved with the legal slowness that tempers even great public interest. The arraignments were formal. Charges were read. The language was blunt, but not vindictive. Lawyers from both sides paced corridors and whispered legal strategies. Amanda's counsel suggested a tactical restraint. Public statements kept short. Evidence presented cleanly. An appeal to the court rather than to the tabloids. For Amanda, the law became a new kind of scaffold, rigid, necessary, inhuman in its pace, but the only thing resembling recourse. In the quieter rooms between legal filings, personal reckonings took their shape. Jacob sat with Philip in a small coffee shop that smelled of roasted beans and weathered wood. Philip ordered without emotion, watching an old man argue with a radio through earphones. "My father fixed a radio like that once," Jacob said, "and the simplest thing in the world, a shared memory of a common fix, made a bridge." Philip listened, then asked about a small scar on Jacob's hand. His questions were businesslike and not meant to wound. They wanted to map a past. Jacob answered simply. He did not claim wisdom he did not have. He claimed endurance. Helen, who had watched the world from the back seat of a car, accustomed to the rules of wealth, handled the reunion with a childlike steadiness. She brought a small toy robot she had kept under her pillow and offered it to Philip as if kindness had no politics. He accepted awkwardly, and then, when the robot's single battery died with a faint sputter, he reached into his pocket for something small he had kept. A scrap of paper with algebra scribbled on it, a map of how to rewire a little motor. He gave it to Helen because it was the one thing he had that matched her toy. The moment was ordinary, and therefore profound. Not all moments were tender. At a police interview, one of the nursery nurses wept as she explained how easy it had been to be browbeaten. "They said I owed them favors," she said. "They said if I kept quiet, my children would not go hungry. I regret it every night." Her confession read like a pattern rather than an exception, small compromises leading to great harms. Meanwhile, a journalist found the doctor's ledger and wrote a piece that turned the scandal into more than personal failure. It framed it as institutional neglect, a hospital that allowed side deals, a system that normalized secrecy. The story ruffled feathers in bureaucratic offices and ended with the hospital's board calling an emergency meeting. St. Nicholas issued a statement promising internal review and cooperation with the investigation. The statement was language carefully chosen to minimize liability, but to offer enough contrition to placate a public that wanted someone punished and some kind of reform. Amanda watched the waves of publicity with a detached fury that had nothing to do with performative outrage. She did not want headlines. She wanted truth. But truth, once given body, radiated consequences. Her philanthropic partners were nervous. Her phone rang with offers of help from some and thinly veiled distance from others. She sat with Jacob on a bench in the hospital garden under a fig tree, the air heavy with the scent of wet leaves, and let the quiet be a kind of counsel. "What do you want?" Amanda asked him once. It was not just a question of legal tactic, it was moral. It was the pivot of the story the title had promised. The poor mechanic returned. What did his presence demand from the woman who had taken his child, no matter the unknowable intent behind that taking? Jacob held the question like a tool. "I want him to know he has a name," Jacob said. "I want him to know where he comes from. I want justice, but not for the sake of cruelness. I want a chance to be a father in a way I have been denied." Amanda nodded. "You'll have it," she said. "We'll make sure of it." The legal process that followed took pains to be meticulous. An indictment was read. The prosecution called witnesses, a nurse who took a bribe, a technician who had catalogued the tape, the public accountant who had traced payments. The defense argued uncertainty, systemic irregularities, attacked chain of custody where they could. Amaka's lawyer attempted the older, softer defense, poverty and pressure, while the prosecutor aimed squarely at the moral agency Amaka had shown. Emma's involvement was described as minimal, but culpable by omission. Cheesum's behavior was painted as a violent extension of the motive to ingratiate himself with wealth. The first public hearing was a show of raw consequences. Amaka stood with her lawyer and a face that had lost the ability to perform innocence convincingly. A woman who had once moved through rooms as if she owned them now stood under the flat light of a courtroom where every small lie was liable to be read. The judge, a stern woman with a history of domestic cases, listened and then set bail that the prosecution described as appropriate to the seriousness of the allegations. Amaka's bail was denied temporarily because of the risk of flight she presented, given the evidence linking her to the exchange of money and the sequence of events that made the hospital look compromised. Cheesum was detained. The charge that touched most people was not the exchange of money, but the small cruelties he had committed against Peter: bullying, orchestrated humiliation, the theft of toys, the deliberate placing of obstacles. These acts, in the open light of court, acquired a new legal meaning. The judge ordered a formal protective custody plan for Peter while the case proceeded, and a child welfare officer was appointed to supervise the child's care. That decision, to protect Peter and to reunite Philip, was Amanda's cross to bear. She had a myriad of legal paths she could take: to demand guardianship of Philip, to facilitate Jacob's parental recognition, to build a care plan that would keep Peter from the threat he had endured. She chose instead to keep both boys under her roof as long as the court permitted, and to work with social services to construct a plan that prioritized the children's welfare over vindication. The first meeting between Amanda and Philip in the mansion was quiet and careful. She showed him his room, smaller than Peter's, modest in decor, but with a desk and a bookshelf that had been chosen with the kind of thought that does not make noise. She did not stage a revelation. She gave him space. Philip wandered the rooms with a mixture of curiosity and clinical observation, measuring the angles of the furniture and the sound of footsteps on rugs. He asked about the library and about access to books. He was less interested in a lap to sit on and more interested in the small mechanism of belonging. Peter watched them from a corner of the nursery through the morning that the boys first met. He did not understand that the name being used had a legal weight. He understood only the tonal pattern of Amanda's voice. When they sat together that afternoon on a rug, toys between them, a robot with dead batteries, a book with crayon marks, Amanda kept her explanations small and true. "You are my son," she told Peter softly. "And now you have a brother named Philip. We will find a way to make room for both of you." The moment was an act of stewardship that cost Amanda something. Public reaction was split. Some hailed her as heroic for keeping both boys, a mother who refused to trade one child for the certainty of heredity. Others criticized her for years of distance, for letting a sister's hand move too close to the scales. Amanda accepted criticism the way she accepted rain: necessary, inconvenient, unable to change the fact. She chose the children. Jacob, for his part, did not ask for titles. He asked for time at first. He wanted to be present in small ways, to help repair the car in the motor court, to maintain the generator, to teach Philip how to fix radios, and to find the pleasure of a shared problem solved. He was offered a job at the mansion, not out of charity, but out of a recognition that simple, honest labor might stitch an honest seam between houses that had been separated by class for a long time. He accepted on his terms, refusing a salary increase that would have come with patronizing strings. Amaka, in detention, spoke in shorter sentences than she had before. The charges closed in like a tide. She claimed that she had intended to help her family, but had not anticipated the scale of the consequence. It was a familiar narrative in courtrooms and kitchens: survival warped into crime. The judge listened with the kind of compassion that is measured and institutional, and set a trial date months away. For now, Amaka remained in custody. Chisholm was remanded to a youth correctional program pending trial. His fury in court made his prospects of rehabilitation uncertain. The hospital's internal review turned into a public inquiry. News outlets asked for change. The hospital's board announced a commitment to transparency and improvement in protocols. Better tagging, clearer transfer logs, an audit of staff payments. The board dismissed 2 administrators who had been connected to payments and employed a new ethics officer. Dr. Admi faced professional disgrace on top of criminal charges. The medical council opened its own inquiry. In quieter moments, Amanda thought about her sister with a complicated tenderness. There were memories of childhood, narrow hallways in a house where they had once shared secrets, and dolls and small betrayals. She could not reconcile the woman who had stolen a life with the girl who had once braided her hair. The human heart contains the capacity to hold contradiction, and Amanda held both love and righteous anger. Philip's acclimation to the mansion was not seamless. He flinched at certain sounds. He did not know the etiquette of dinner parties. He had a fierce need to be useful and would bolt to the shed to ask Jacob about a tool if he felt awkward at a formal gathering. He began to sleep better, and his cheeks filled as his body received regular, reliable meals. A pediatrician working with Amanda drew up a plan for his physical recovery and an educational program to nourish the intellect that had been starved. Peter, meanwhile, thrived in ways that mattered to Amanda. She intensified his therapy, hired a specialist who taught tactile reading, and filled the house with audible cues. Amanda's love for him reshaped itself into a public work. She advocated for better protections for children with disabilities and used her grief to fuel a philanthropic pivot that would later be called both brave and strategically useful. In the public imagination, the story took on the shape of a moral. Money cannot buy everything. Yet the moral made people complacent. Beneath the tidy lesson lay 1,000 small failures. Nurses who accepted bribes had been hungry. A mother who accepted a child had been exhausted. A sister's greed had been rationalized into a survival strategy. Jacob's return had been both an act of love and an indictment of systems that allow adults to make cruel choices. Amarka, in a brief televised arraignment, tried to speak to the camera but was coached by a lawyer with the habit of measured cadence. The words regret and misunderstanding and poverty were rolled out. People in off-camera cafes argued, was she a villain or a symptom? Those arguments allowed for moral distancing. The point of the law, however, was not to satisfy public debate, but to adjudicate responsibility. The wheels turned slowly. When the first plea bargaining came, Amarka's team attempted to reduce charges in exchange for testimony against Dr. Admi and the nurse. The prosecution considered the offer. The judge required that anything accepted would be made public record. Amarka refused to give the whole story at first, which left the prosecution with an edge, to demonstrate that the conspiracy extended beyond the family and into a corrupted administration. The trial was scheduled, and the city waited. One night, when the case was a month into public process and the first hearings had been noisy but preliminary, Jacob sat alone with Philip on the mansion's back terrace. The moon had come out thin as a silver blade, and the night smelled of distant sea and exhaust. Philip unrolled a map he had drawn in the orphanage, a meticulous diagram of routes and the layout of a house he had never occupied. He pointed out where he imagined a study to be and where a radio would sit. "Do you think I can learn to fix a car?" he asked, not with the sting of poverty, but with the hunger of curiosity. Jacob smiled in a way that eased his face. He had a long history of repairing objects and a shorter history of mending relationships. "Yes," he said, "but the first thing you must learn is how to be patient with yourself. The second is how to listen to the engine. It will tell you where to look." Philip nodded like a scholar, and then, in a voice barely above the sound of the night, asked, Why did she take me? Jacob's hands closed around his mug. He could have preached 1,000 things about choices and greed, but he chose honesty. Some people make choices to survive. Others make them to get more than they need. It doesn't make it right. It makes it what it is. But you are here now, and we will choose you. The days of the trial approached like a coming wind. Evidence rooms grew heavy with documents. Witnesses practiced testimony. The legal arguments ranged from the technical, chain of custody, and the admissibility of certain framed footage, to the human, the motives of a sister who had calculated her steps. Amanda concentrated on the latter. In private, she rehearsed a statement she might make to the court, one that would not become a display of vengeance, but a testimony to a mother's bewilderment and love. The first day of the trial was packed. The gallery filled with people whose voices hummed like electric wires. Reporters sat like a perimeter. The judge sat like the stern pivot of a carousel, making sure the horses did not leap their tracks. Amanda took the stand when called. Her testimony was direct. She described the early days of the nursery, the trust she had given, the smell of a newborn. She spoke of loss, and then of the discovery that had followed, of the tape and what it had shown. She did not allow pity to become performance. She spoke plainly about the thing the law would need to hear, the sequence of deceit. Amaka, who had once moved through the world with unearned assurance, sat in the dock and listened. At times, she stared at a place no one else could see. At times, she looked at Amanda as if seeking something human to fill a hollow. The jurors took notes. The prosecution called Dr. Admi and the nurse and the technician. Each added a tile to the mosaic of events. When the prosecutor's presentation wound toward a crescendo, he asked the jury to consider not only the act, but the pattern, a willful bypassing of care, a transfer of a life like a commodity, the betrayal of a sister. He spoke with controlled heat, righteous, but not sensational. The defense tried to counter with mitigating circumstances, pressure, poverty, and the fragility of memory. The facts, however, were not simply a contest of sympathies. They were a ledger of choices. In the end, the jury's guilty finding on counts of conspiracy and unlawful release of an infant stunned no one who had read the tape. Amaka was sentenced to a term that reflected the seriousness of the crime and the mitigating claim of exigent motive. The sentence was long enough to be a punishment and short enough to leave room for redemption in the public imagination. Chisholm's conviction followed on related charges concerning the abuse of a vulnerable child. His sentence included mandated counseling and juvenile detention measures. Dr. Admi lost his license and faced a professional ban. The legal closure did not mean the emotional traces disappeared. Amanda visited Amaka once in the visitation room set aside for jailed visitors and asked questions that were not the judge's to enforce. Why? What had turned a sister into an actor of theft? Amaka offered a story that braided fear and pride and the strain of a life pushed to the edge. She offered tears that were sometimes real and sometimes practiced. The narrator is not blind to the possibility of performance in courtship of pity. Amanda listened, measured. She did not forgive. She left with a sense of loss more complicated than anger, sorrow for a woman who had made the choice, and a fear at how easily desperation could tip a conscience. In months that followed, Amanda's public life became a new kind of work. She used the platform the scandal had unwillingly given her to advocate for hospital transparency and stronger protections for displaced children. She founded an initiative that funded improvements in neonatal care at hospitals and resources for orphanages. Journalists likened her moral pivot to the kind of reinvention wealth can buy. Amanda accepted that critique if it meant practical change. She did not believe wealth itself was virtue. She believed in accountability and structure. Jacob continued to work around the mansion and in its garage. He did not become a figure of myth. He arrived muddy and plain, bought small things from the market, and kept his humor. He taught Philip to read the dial of a machine and to find the smell of a failing gasket. He taught Helen how to change a tire. He allowed himself the quiet pleasure of small competence, of being needed for a reason that did not require a title. Philip grew with the furious curiosity of a child who had once learned that hunger could be converted into resource. He entered school with a scholarship Amanda arranged, and found teachers who lit his mind like matches. He was not free of trauma. Nights came where he awoke thin with the echo of abandonment. He received counseling and the shelter of a family that refused to make him a mere emblem. He was not put on a pedestal. He was put on a path. Peter adapted into a life that had both the grace of a child loved by a mother and the scars of small cruelties he had not deserved. Amanda thought of him often with a tenderness that asked no return. She knew she could not erase the years he had not had, but she could fill the future with constancy. The community that had first gossiped at the gates watched the slow mending. Some neighbors came with food and quiet apologies for prior slights. Others kept distance. The mansion's staff, whose loyalties had been tested, rearranged themselves into a team reshaped by truth. The butler stayed, begrudgingly noble, and the gardener kept tending as if the healing of soil might teach the people who walked across it. Narratively, the collapse of the House of Lies made a new architecture. Truth had been the demolisher and the builder. The public spectacle had a sting, but the private work was more consequential. A mother who could hold 2 boys, a mechanic who had reclaimed fatherhood in the still, honest way of hands at work, a sister whose punishment would become a cautionary tale, an institution forced to change. The legal aftermath remained open-ended. Appeals and civil suits sprouted like offshoots. The hospital paid a settlement to Amanda and to the orphanage to fund improvements. Amaka served her sentence and began, in the small daylight of a prison library, to consider how to reconstruct a life from tangled roots. Chisholm undertook a forced rehabilitation program, which was the thin reed some hoped might straighten him. Dr. Adami's disgrace became a chapter in medical journals about ethics and the vulnerabilities of underfunded care. Amanda did not bask in the vindication. Instead, she spent time with children and in courtrooms working on legislative reform. Jacob, who had wanted nothing more than to be a father in practice, came to accept invitations to family dinners and school events. And sometimes he sat at the back of Amanda's philanthropic meetings, not as a figurehead, but as a man whose presence lent a moral gravity that no speech could manufacture. On a night with rain on the roof, and the hush that comes after the city's clamour has fallen, Amanda sat in the nursery with both boys asleep. Peter's breath even and small, Philip curled with a book half open as if he might wake and read the rest. Jacob had left earlier that evening with Helen asleep in his arms after teaching her how to rig a small motor to light a lantern. The house, mended in parts and still cracking in others, held its quiet like a promise to be kept. The poor mechanic had returned and, in returning, set into motion the disassembly of a careful lie. He had not come as a conqueror or as a man seeking recompense. He had come because a father's instincts do not rest. His hands, the hands that fixed engines and radios, that bore scars from a beating to keep him quiet, had opened the locked room where untruths were kept. In the end, what collapsed was not only the mansion's facade, but the comforting fiction that wealth could sanitize betrayal. Amanda learned, painfully and stubbornly, that motherhood is not a fact proven by blood alone. It is a practice, a series of choices repeated into habit. She kept both of her sons, not out of defiance of the law, but as a commitment to the children who had been harmed by adult decisions. The law had offered consequence. She offered care. The last image is quiet. Jacob's hand on the gate where the paint had peeled, now a little smoother from use. Amanda at the nursery window watching 2 boys asleep. The mansion's lights dimmed but still on. A city that keeps turning outside, full of its small violences and small acts of grace. Justice had been served in part, restitution had begun, and some questions were left to answer in time. The house itself had learned a new humility. If this story moved you, leave a thought below about what you would do in Amanda's place, and subscribe to follow the next chapter. There are more rooms to open.